Sir, we found $2.3 million missing. The FBI agent's words echoed through the boardroom as every executive's face went white, except mine. I was smiling. You see, 3 months earlier, they'd fired me after 25 years and replaced me with the VP's golf buddy who couldn't tell a balance sheet from a cocktail napkin. They thought I'd just disappear quietly. They were wrong. My name is Zephyr Kane, and this is how I watched a $400 million healthcare empire crumble because one executive chose his drinking buddy over decades of experience. Spoiler alert. When federal agents start asking questions about missing millions, nobody cares about your golf handicap anymore. I'd started at Meridian Healthcare Group fresh out of my CPA certification in 1999, worked my way up from junior accountant to senior auditor, then financial analyst, and finally chief financial controller. I knew every regulation, every compliance requirement, every federal guideline that governed healthcare finance, the Stark Law, anti-kickback statute, Medicare billing requirements. I could recite them in my sleep because one mistake could cost the company millions in penalties, or even shut us down entirely. My department had an impeccable track record, 0 compliance violations in 15 years, clean audits from both internal reviewers and federal inspectors. We'd helped Meridian expand from 3 clinics to a network of 12 hospitals and 47 outpatient facilities across 3 states. Every acquisition, every merger, every expansion had been financially sound because I made sure we crossed every T and dotted every I. The healthcare industry doesn't forgive financial mistakes. One billing error can trigger a federal investigation. One compliance oversight can result in millions in fines. One accounting irregularity can destroy decades of reputation overnight. That's why healthcare organizations need financial controllers who understand that accuracy isn't just important. It's literally a matter of survival. I'd built a team of 8 certified accountants who shared my commitment to precision. We double-checked everything, maintained meticulous records, and treated every transaction like it might be scrutinized by federal auditors tomorrow, because in healthcare finance, it very well might be. My office overlooked the main campus where thousands of patients received care every day, families trusting us with their health, their money, their insurance claims. Every number in every spreadsheet represented real people whose lives depended on us getting the financial side right. That responsibility had guided every decision I'd made for 25 years. Everything changed in January when Richard Blackwood arrived as the new VP of Operations. Fresh from a consulting firm in Manhattan, wearing suits that cost more than my monthly mortgage, and carrying a briefcase full of efficiency protocols that he'd apparently learned from some business school case study. He'd never worked in healthcare before, but according to CEO Patricia Holbrook, that was exactly what we needed. Fresh perspective. His first company meeting was a masterclass in corporate buzzword bingo. We need to streamline our processes, he announced, clicking through PowerPoint slides filled with charts that looked impressive but meant nothing. Healthcare is becoming increasingly competitive, and we need to eliminate redundancies while maximizing operational efficiency. I'd heard this speech before from other executives who thought healthcare finance was just like any other business. They never lasted long once they realized that streamlining in healthcare meant federal investigators asking uncomfortable questions about missing documentation. Richard's background was in retail consulting. He'd spent 5 years helping clothing stores optimize their inventory management. Apparently, someone at corporate thought that tracking sweaters and tracking Medicare reimbursements required the same skill set. The man had never heard of HIPAA compliance, didn't know what a Stark Law violation looked like, and thought audit trails were hiking paths in Colorado. Within his first week, Richard was asking questions that made my skin crawl. Why did we need so many approvals for expense reports? Why couldn't we automate more of the billing processes? Why were we paying for external audit reviews when we had internal accountants? Each question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how healthcare finance actually worked. The warning signs were everywhere. During budget meetings, he'd interrupt my explanations about regulatory requirements to ask about cost-benefit analysis. When I explained why certain procedures couldn't be streamlined, he'd make notes in his leather portfolio with a look that said he thought I was just being difficult. His office was directly across from mine, and I could see him through the glass walls, always on phone calls with people from his previous consulting firm. always gesturing animatedly while discussing optimization opportunities and low-hanging fruit. I started documenting everything. Every meeting, every suggestion, every time he dismissed a compliance requirement as bureaucratic red tape. Something told me I'd need those notes later. The ambush came on a Tuesday morning in March. Patricia Holbrook called me into her office where Richard was already seated, looking like a man who'd just won a poker hand. "Zephyr," she began, not meeting my eyes, "we've decided to restructure the financial department to better align with our new operational goals." Restructure, the corporate euphemism for, "You're fired, but we're going to pretend it's strategic." Richard leaned forward, flipping through a folder that I'd later learn contained a performance review I'd never seen. "We need someone who can think outside the traditional healthcare finance box," he said. "Someone who understands that regulations are guidelines, not roadblocks." I felt my stomach drop. Regulations weren't guidelines. They were federal law. The fact that he couldn't distinguish between the two told me everything I needed to know about where this conversation was heading. "We're promoting you to a senior advisory role," Patricia continued, using another euphemism. Advisory role meant no authority, no decision-making power, and no ability to prevent whatever disaster they were planning. "Derek Hoffman will be taking over as Chief Financial Controller effective immediately." Derek Hoffman, Richard's golf buddy from his previous consulting firm. A man whose financial experience consisted of managing the budget for a chain of sporting goods stores. He'd never worked in healthcare, didn't have the required CPA certification for the position, and based on our brief conversation at the company Christmas party, thought Medicare was just health insurance for old people. "Derek brings fresh energy and innovative thinking to the role," Richard said, as if reading from a script. "He's not burdened by outdated approaches to financial management." Outdated approaches, like following federal regulations and maintaining audit trails that could withstand government scrutiny, like understanding that healthcare finance wasn't a game where you could move money around and hope nobody noticed. I looked at Patricia, trying to find some sign that she understood what they were doing. She'd been CEO for 8 years, had seen what happened to healthcare companies that cut corners on compliance, but her expression was carefully neutral, the look of someone who'd already made a decision and didn't want to discuss it. "When does this transition take effect?" I asked. "Derek starts Monday," Richard said. "We'll need you to spend the week bringing him up to speed on current processes." Current processes that he'd probably ignore within a month. 3 weeks after Derek took over, I was cleaning out the last of my old files when my phone buzzed with a text from Linda Martinez, one of my former team members. "Can you meet me for coffee? Something's wrong with the Medicare billing reports." Linda had been with the department for 12 years, knew the billing systems better than anyone. If she said something was wrong, it was worth investigating. We met at a cafe downtown, away from the office, where she showed me screenshots she'd taken of Derek's recent approval decisions. "Look at this," she whispered, sliding her phone across the table. "He approved a $340,000 equipment purchase from a vendor I've never heard of. No competitive bidding, no board approval, just his signature on a purchase order." I studied the image. The vendor was listed as Premier Medical Solutions LLC, with an address that looked suspiciously like a P.O. box. In healthcare, equipment purchases over $50,000 required board approval and competitive bidding to prevent kickback schemes. Derek had bypassed both requirements. "There's more," Linda continued. "He's been approving overtime payments for staff that don't exist in our system. Phantom employees getting paychecks deposited into accounts I can't trace. And the Medicare billing? Zephyr. He's billing for procedures that weren't performed." Each revelation was worse than the last. Phantom employees meant payroll fraud. Billing for non-existent procedures meant Medicare fraud. Equipment purchases without proper approvals could be kickback schemes. Any one of these issues could trigger a federal investigation that would shut down the entire organization. "Have you reported this to Patricia?" I asked. Linda shook her head. "I tried to schedule a meeting, but her assistant said she's too busy with the board retreat. Besides, Derek told everyone that questioning his decisions shows resistance to change and could result in termination." I felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. 25 years in healthcare finance had taught me that these weren't just policy violations, They were criminal activities that could destroy the organization and put patient care at risk. When healthcare companies lost their Medicare certification due to fraud investigations, people died while searching for alternative care. "Linda," I said, "I need you to document everything. Screenshots, dates, amounts, vendor information. Can you do that without Derek knowing?" She nodded. "Already started." Over the next 2 weeks, Linda and I built a case that would make federal prosecutors salivate. We met every few days at different locations, coffee shops, restaurants, even once in the parking lot of a grocery store, as she passed me documentation of Derek's increasingly brazen violations. The phantom payroll scheme was sophisticated. Derek had created 12 fake employees with real Social Security numbers purchased from identity thieves. Each phantom employee worked exactly 29 hours per week to avoid triggering full-time benefits, and their paychecks were deposited into accounts controlled by shell companies that Richard had helped establish. Total weekly theft, $8,400. The Medicare fraud was even worse. Derek was billing for consultation services that never happened, using the credentials of doctors who'd left the organization months earlier. He was also upcoding procedures, billing Medicare for expensive treatments while providing cheaper alternatives to patients. The billing discrepancies totaled over $400,000 in just 3 weeks. But the equipment fraud was the masterpiece. Derek was purchasing medical equipment from companies that existed only on paper, paying inflated prices, and having the equipment delivered to warehouse addresses that weren't affiliated with Meridian. The equipment would then be resold to other healthcare organizations at market rates, with the profits flowing back to offshore accounts. I spent my evenings organizing everything into a comprehensive report: bank routing numbers, Social Security numbers of phantom employees, Medicare billing codes, equipment serial numbers, and a detailed timeline showing how each scheme had developed. I cross-referenced everything with federal regulations, highlighting which laws had been violated and what penalties could result. The most damning evidence came from Derek's own computer. Linda had discovered that he'd been using the same password for everything: Golf Buddy 123. His email contained dozens of messages coordinating the fraud schemes with Richard and several external accomplices. They'd been treating the healthcare organization like their personal ATM, assuming that nobody would notice or care. By the time I finished compiling the evidence, I had a 47-page report documenting systematic fraud across multiple federal jurisdictions: Medicare fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy charges that could result in decades of prison time for everyone involved. I made 3 copies of everything: one for my safety deposit box, one for my attorney, and one for the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Task Force. The call to the FBI hotline was surprisingly straightforward. Agent Sarah Morrison from the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Task Force called me back within 6 hours. Her voice was crisp and professional as she scheduled a meeting for the following morning at their downtown field office. "Mr. Kane, based on your initial report, we're opening a formal investigation. Please bring all documentation and be prepared for an extensive interview." The FBI building was exactly what you'd expect: serious concrete and glass with security measures that made airport checkpoints look casual. Agent Morrison was in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that comes from years of unraveling complex financial crimes. She was joined by Agent David Chen from the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. "Healthcare fraud is our highest priority," Agent Morrison explained as we settled into a conference room lined with whiteboards. "The schemes you've documented represent multiple federal crimes with potential sentences of 20 years or more per violation." I walked them through everything: the phantom payroll scheme, the Medicare billing fraud, the equipment purchases, and the web of shell companies that Richard and Derek had established to launder the money. Agent Chen took detailed notes, while Agent Morrison asked pointed questions about internal controls and oversight procedures. "How long do you estimate these activities have been ongoing?" Agent Chen asked. "Based on the documentation I have, at least 6 weeks, but I suspect they started planning this before Derek was even hired. Some of the shell companies were incorporated 2 months before my termination." Agent Morrison nodded grimly. "We'll need to interview your source within the organization. Can you arrange that?" I texted Linda, who agreed to meet with the agents that afternoon. Meanwhile, they began the process of obtaining federal warrants for Derek's financial records, Richard's communications, and the bank accounts associated with the shell companies. "Mr. Kane," Agent Morrison said as we concluded the meeting, "we'd like you to consider working as a confidential informant. Your expertise in healthcare finance and your knowledge of the organization's systems would be invaluable in building this case." I thought about Patricia Holbrook, who'd trusted Richard's judgment over my 25 years of experience, about the patients whose Medicare benefits were being stolen to fund golf trips and luxury cars. "What do you need me to do?" The FBI moved faster than I'd expected. Within 72 hours of my interview, they had obtained warrants for Derek's bank records, Richard's email accounts, and the financial records of all 6 shell companies involved in the fraud schemes. What they found exceeded even my worst assumptions about the scope of the operation. Derek and Richard hadn't just been stealing from Meridian, they'd been running similar schemes at Richard's previous consulting clients. The sporting goods chain where Derek had worked as a financial manager. They'd embezzled $400,000 before leaving for better opportunities. 2 retail clients of Richard's consulting firm had discovered inventory discrepancies totaling over $200,000 after he'd completed his efficiency reviews. Agent Morrison called me on Friday afternoon with an update that made my head spin. "We've identified $2.3 million in fraudulent transactions across multiple organizations, wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, luxury car purchases, and a golf membership at an exclusive resort in Arizona that costs $50,000 annually." The Medicare fraud alone was staggering. Derek had been billing for ghost patients, people who'd died months earlier, but whose Medicare numbers were still active in the system. He'd also been submitting claims for expensive medical equipment that was never delivered, pocketing the reimbursements through a network of fake medical supply companies. "There's something else," Agent Morrison continued. "Patricia Holbrook, your CEO, received several payments from one of Richard's shell companies, consulting fees for services that were never performed. It appears she was aware of at least some of the financial irregularities." That revelation hit me like a physical blow. Patricia had known. When she'd fired me and hired Derek, she'd known about Richard's background and the suspicious consulting payments. She'd chosen to enable the fraud rather than protect the organization she'd led for 8 years. "We're executing search warrants Monday morning," Agent Morrison said. "Federal agents will be arriving at Meridian's offices at 6 a.m. to secure financial records and arrest Derek and Richard. We'll also be seizing Patricia's office and personal files." I thought about all the employees who'd arrive Monday morning expecting a normal workday, only to find FBI agents cataloging evidence of systematic fraud. About the patients whose trust had been violated by executives who saw healthcare as just another opportunity for theft. Justice was finally coming to Meridian Healthcare Group. My phone started ringing at 5:47 a.m. on Monday morning. The caller ID showed Meridian's main number, but the voice wasn't anyone I recognized. "Mr. Kane, this is Agent Morrison. We're currently executing search warrants at Meridian Healthcare Group, and we need your immediate assistance." I drove to the office through the pre-dawn darkness, my mind racing through everything that was about to unfold. The parking lot was filled with black SUVs and white forensic vans. FBI agents in windbreakers were carrying boxes of evidence out of the building while others photographed everything in Derek's office. Agent Morrison met me at the main entrance, where employees were gathering in confused clusters, trying to understand why federal agents had taken over their workplace. "Derek Hoffman and Richard Blackwood are in custody," she said. "Patricia Holbrook is being questioned downtown. We need you to help us understand the financial systems and identify any additional evidence." Derek's office was a crime scene now, with every document, every computer file, every handwritten note being cataloged as evidence. His computer was still logged in, displaying emails that would probably add years to his eventual prison sentence. Richard's office was in similar chaos, with agents photographing his golf trophies and expensive artwork that had apparently been purchased with stolen Medicare funds. The most shocking discovery was in Patricia's office. Hidden in her desk drawer was a handwritten ledger documenting her share of the fraud proceeds. She'd been receiving $15,000 monthly payments for consulting services that consisted of ignoring obvious financial irregularities and blocking any attempts to investigate Derek's activities. "Mr. Kane," Agent Morrison said as we reviewed the seized documents. "The board of directors has requested an emergency meeting. They want to understand the scope of the damage and discuss immediate remediation measures. Would you be willing to consult with them on restoring financial integrity to the organization?" I looked around Derek's former office, thinking about the 47 medical facilities and thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on Meridian surviving this scandal, about the patients who needed those facilities to remain operational, while federal investigators sorted through the wreckage. What kind of consulting are we talking about? Full authority to restructure the financial department, implement new oversight procedures, and work directly with federal monitors to ensure compliance. Essentially, your old job with expanded authority and direct reporting to the federal compliance team. The irony was perfect. The emergency board meeting that afternoon was unlike anything in Meridian's corporate history. 7 board members sat around the conference table with FBI agents, federal compliance monitors, and Department of Health and Human Services investigators. The mood was grim as Agent Morrison presented the preliminary findings of their investigation. The defendants orchestrated a sophisticated fraud scheme that stole approximately $2.3 million from Medicare, Medicaid, and the organization's operating funds. She began, clicking through slides that documented the evidence. Derek Hoffman and Richard Blackwood are facing federal charges including wire fraud, healthcare fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Each charge carries a potential sentence of 20 years in federal prison. Patricia Holbrook's involvement was even more damaging to the organization's reputation. As CEO, she'd accepted $180,000 in bribe payments to ignore financial irregularities and prevent internal investigations. Her cooperation with the fraud scheme elevated the charges from individual misconduct to corporate conspiracy. The organization faces potential penalties of $50 million and exclusion from all federal healthcare programs. Agent Morrison continued. However, the Department of Health and Human Services is willing to negotiate a settlement if Meridian demonstrates full cooperation and implements comprehensive compliance reforms. Board Chairman Robert Sterling turned to me with the expression of a man who just realized his golf buddy had been playing with loaded dice. "Mr. Kane, would you be willing to return as Chief Financial Officer and work with federal monitors to rebuild our compliance systems?" The offer was unprecedented. Full authority over all financial operations, a salary increase of 40%, and direct reporting authority to both the board and federal compliance monitors. I would essentially be running the financial side of a $400 million organization while federal investigators completed their work. "I'll need complete autonomy to restructure the department," I said. "No interference from executives, no questions about compliance procedures, and the authority to terminate any employee who doesn't meet federal standards." "Done," Sterling replied immediately. Derek and Richard's arrests made the evening news. Video footage of them being led away in handcuffs while FBI agents carried boxes of evidence from their offices. Patricia's resignation was announced the same day, along with the appointment of an interim CEO who would work directly with federal monitors. The man they'd replaced for being too rigid was now the only person qualified to save the organization they'd nearly destroyed. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new corner office, the one that had previously belonged to Patricia Holbrook, reviewing compliance reports that would have been impossible under the old system. The federal monitoring agreement had transformed Meridian from a typical healthcare organization into a model of financial transparency and regulatory compliance. Derek Hoffman had pleaded guilty to 14 federal charges and received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison. Richard Blackwood's trial was scheduled for the following month, but his attorney was already negotiating a plea deal that would likely result in 8 to 10 years behind bars. Patricia Holbrook had cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence of 5 years and permanent exclusion from healthcare executive positions. The financial recovery had exceeded everyone's expectations. Federal investigators had traced the stolen funds through multiple offshore accounts and shell companies, recovering $1.8 million of the original $2.3 million theft. Asset forfeiture proceedings were ongoing for luxury cars, real estate, and other purchases made with stolen funds. More importantly, the compliance reforms had positioned Meridian as a leader in healthcare financial integrity. Our new systems included real-time monitoring of all financial transactions, mandatory dual approval for any expenditure over $10,000, and quarterly reviews by independent compliance auditors. The Department of Health and Human Services had cited our reforms as a model for other healthcare organizations. My team had grown from 8 accountants to 15 certified compliance specialists, each with specialized training in different aspects of healthcare finance regulation. We'd implemented blockchain-based audit trails that made financial fraud virtually impossible, and our Medicare billing accuracy rate had improved to 99.7%, the highest in the state. The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard Blackwood had fired me for being too rigid about compliance, then hired a criminal who'd nearly destroyed the organization through fraud. The man they'd thought was an obstacle to efficiency had become the person responsible for saving the company and establishing industry-leading standards. Board Chairman Sterling had offered me Patricia's former position as CEO, but I'd declined. I preferred building and maintaining systems that prevented fraud rather than managing executives who might try to circumvent them. The work was more satisfying than anything I'd done in 25 years. 2 years after the FBI raid, Meridian Healthcare Group had become a case study taught in business schools and compliance training programs across the country. Harvard Business School invited me to speak about the importance of financial integrity in healthcare organizations. The Department of Health and Human Services cited our compliance reforms in congressional testimony about preventing Medicare fraud. The personal satisfaction went deeper than professional recognition. Every day, I received reports showing that our systems were working exactly as designed. 0 billing irregularities, 0 phantom employees, 0 unauthorized expenditures. We'd built a financial fortress that could withstand scrutiny from any federal agency. Derek's conviction had created ripple effects throughout the healthcare industry. Other organizations began conducting internal audits to identify potential fraud schemes, and several consulting firms found themselves under federal investigation for similar activities. The Government Accountability Office estimated that our case had helped prevent over $100 million in potential healthcare fraud across multiple states. Linda Martinez had been promoted to Senior Compliance Analyst and was completing her CPA certification with tuition assistance from Meridian. Several other employees who'd helped document the fraud had received performance bonuses and promotions. The organization now rewarded people who identified compliance issues, rather than punishing them for asking uncomfortable questions. The golf course where Richard and Derek had planned their schemes had expelled both of them from membership and implemented new policies about members' business activities. Apparently, federal fraud convictions were bad for the club's reputation among healthcare executives and government contractors. My daughter called me from college last month to tell me about a healthcare ethics class where they'd studied the Meridian case. "Dad," she said, "my professor said you proved that one person with integrity can expose an entire criminal conspiracy. She called you a hero." I'd never thought of myself as a hero. I was just someone who understood that numbers don't lie, regulations exist for good reasons, and healthcare organizations have obligations that go beyond quarterly profits. When people trust you with their medical care and their Medicare benefits, you don't get to treat that trust as an opportunity for theft. Sometimes doing the right thing takes longer than expected, but it always pays off in the end. The phone on my desk buzzed with a call from Agent Morrison. Another healthcare organization in Nevada had discovered financial irregularities and requested my assistance as a federal compliance consultant. Justice never sleeps. 5 years have passed since that Tuesday morning when they told me I was being restructured out of my position. As I write this, I'm sitting in my home office, overlooking the desert landscape outside Phoenix, preparing for my testimony before a Senate subcommittee on healthcare fraud prevention. Meridian Healthcare Group survived the scandal and thrived under the new compliance regime. The organization now generates $600 million in annual revenue while maintaining the highest compliance standards in the industry. 0 fraud investigations, 0 federal violations, and a reputation that attracts the best medical professionals in the region. I'd left Meridian after 3 years as Chief Financial Officer to start my own consulting firm specializing in healthcare compliance and fraud prevention. Federal agencies now contract with my company to investigate suspected fraud at healthcare organizations across the country. We've helped recover over $50 million in stolen funds and prevented countless additional fraudulent schemes. The work is challenging and rewarding in ways I never expected. Last month, I helped expose a scheme at a hospital network in Texas where executives were billing Medicare for surgeries performed on deceased patients. 2 months ago, I testified in the criminal trial of a pharmacy chain owner who'd been filling prescriptions with sugar pills while billing insurance companies for expensive medications. Derek Hoffman was released from federal prison last year after serving 8 years of his sentence. He's working at a convenience store in Ohio and will be prohibited from handling financial transactions for any healthcare organization for the rest of his life. Richard Blackwood is still incarcerated, having been convicted in additional fraud cases involving his consulting clients. Patricia Holbrook completed her 5-year sentence and now works for a nonprofit organization focused on helping formerly incarcerated individuals find employment. She sent me a letter last Christmas, apologizing for her role in the scandal and thanking me for exposing the fraud before it could cause even more damage. The letter sits framed on my office wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that good people can make terrible decisions when they prioritize convenience over integrity. My phone rings constantly with calls from healthcare organizations requesting compliance audits, fraud investigations, and system reforms. Each case is different, but the underlying principle remains the same. Healthcare finance isn't just about numbers on spreadsheets. It's about maintaining the trust that patients place in the medical system. Sometimes the right thing takes 25 years to pay off, but it always does. Is